Good afternoon everyone, and welcome to this online presentation on the music of Sir Charles Villiers Stanford. Before we begin, however, I should say that it was with the very deepest regret that we heard some 10 days ago of the death on the 10th of January of Dr. Francis Jackson, CBE. Our condolences have been sent to his family, and suffice it here to say that tributes have already appeared on the Royal College of Organists website and in both the national and local press. There will be many more during the weeks to come, some in the newsletters of the local organist associations, including that of Herald. And today's talk will indeed include some pieces played by the late Dr. Jackson. This is not intended in any way to be a biographical talk on Stanford. Those of you who want to discover more about Stanford's fascinating life should look no further than Jeremy Dibble's marvellous book, which is a musicological survey as well as a very thorough biographical history of Stanford. It is, of course, helpful to know a basic chronology, which I'll just go through very briefly. Stanford grew up in Dublin, where he was taught by the organist of St. Patrick's Cathedral, Robert Prescott Stewart. St. Patrick's then was in no sense a backwater, but really was quite an intense musical setup. We really hear very little about Prescott Stewart, but by all accounts he was a marvellous performer of orchestral arrangements on the organ. It's a kind of Irish W.T. Best, you might say. And Prescott Stewart was certainly the one who engendered Stanford's vocation, if you like. In 1870, Stanford won the first ever organ scholarship to Cambridge University. This was at Queen's College, and it finally led, a couple of years later, to his becoming organist of Trinity College, where he served for about 20 years. After he left Trinity in 1892, he continued at Cambridge as Professor of Music. He was also one of the founders of the Royal College of Music in London in 1883, and he taught composition there for the rest of his life. It's now quite well known that Stanford was a notoriously difficult character. We can hardly believe this, hardly believe the stories, when we listen to some of his gentler pieces, such as the magical Stanford in G, or the truly wonderful Blue Bird. Thomas Tertius Noble, who was organist of York Minster just over 100 years ago, was one of his many famous pupils, and Noble's memoirs recall that composition lessons with Stanford either consisted of blunt criticism, which meant it was very good, or consisted of Stanford's flying into a rage, tearing up the students' work and throwing it into the bin. No stultifying regulation in those days, of course. But obviously his sententious comments had quite an effect, since everyone wanted to study with him. His famous pupils include Herbert Howells, Vaughan Williams, Gustav Holst, John Ireland, and the master of the King's music, Arthur Bliss. So today, this is a talk about how I personally encountered and experienced Stanford's music as I grew up. And it was really only through his church and organ music that I actually came across him. I was never aware of his contribution to anything like organ design, although as far as I know his influence was not inconsiderable in that regard, and it needs an article doing somewhere. He was, for instance, the consultant on the Hill rebuild of 1889 in Trinity College Chapel, and that was just a year before Hill did Sydney Town Hall. It would make a fascinating study just to see how much Trinity had to do with Sydney, so to speak. As a youngster, I never really found myself drawn to Stanford's music at all. It was just there, I suppose, by chance. I was a kind of Johnny-come-lately chorister, never really sang treble at all, so when I encountered Stanford in G, the beautiful Magnificat, with its spinning wheel effects, it really meant very little to me. All I remember thinking was that the organ part looked incredibly difficult. At least I thought that when I was just 14 years old. I wasn't allowed to play it until I was 16, some 2 years later. So here is Stanford in G, sung by the Minster Choir, York Minster Choir, in a recording made by the late John Rotherer from 1957. That was Stanford in G Magnificat, performed by York Minster Choir in a recording by the late John Rotherer, made about 1957. The organist, I believe, is probably Eric Parsons, who was the assistant at that time. So it was really just as an organist that, over the years, I encountered Stanford's compositions more meaningfully. Although in the first place, I was actually put off them. When I was at school, Wiggiston School in Leicester, the music master appeared one day with a book of Stanford's Preludes and Postludes. It was the first book, and he sat down and played a couple of them, and it really made no impression at all. I wasn't in the least bit interested, and so he gave them to two fellow pupils, both of whom started to learn. I wasn't interested in pieces which were just 2 pages long. Even in those days I needed something more to get my teeth into. But gradually over the years I've come to see that these pieces have quite a lot going for them. In fact, that they are wonderful little gems, and many of them I played as voluntaries in York when I was there. So here is the one that a fellow pupil at Wiggiston School used to play quite frequently. It's the one in G minor from the first book. It's a kind of little mini fantasia, and here we now then go back to 1964. was Stanford's marvellous chant to Psalm 149. Here it is, sung by the Minster Choir in 1991, conducted by Philip Moore, to part of Psalm 145. So that was more or less it until I got to Waltham Abbey in 1971. That was where I first encountered the settings, the Magnificat in B flat and C, both of which I greatly enjoyed. At that point, I had no idea that one of the first performances of Stanford in C had taken place in York Minster with Stanford present. So it was at Waltham Abbey that I first got to know the unaccompanied anthems as well, Beati Quorum, Celos Ascendit, Glorious and Powerful God, all conducted by the Director of Music, Norman Rimmer. I really only discovered the great anthems of Stanford when I first got to York. However, in 1975, they were something of a revelation. I scarcely knew they existed at the time. Dr. Jackson's rehearsing, for instance, The Lord is my Shepherd, was a wonderful musical experience of itself. FJ taught me how to accompany these pieces, concentrating on the drama and the colour. These are performances which I remember more vividly than any others of my whole life. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a recording of Minster Choir singing The Lord is my Shepherd, but here is one from Ripon Cathedral, recorded in 1983 and conducted by the Director of Music there, Ronald Perrin. Ron was Dr. Jackson's assistant from 1957 to 67, and this certainly does have something of FJ about it.
Oh
There is also a marvellous unaccompanied great anthem called "O Praise the Lord of Heaven," which I used to do with my girls' choir in York. And then there's the somewhat sporadically heard but very dramatically powerful "For Lo, I Raise Up." And also another piece which we very rarely hear called "And I Saw Another Angel," a rather beautiful setting of those wonderful words. But then, of course, there are other little gems as well. Here is probably what is Stanford's most famous anthem of all, the Latin motet Beate Quorum Vir, which I first met in 1970 when I heard it directed at Royal Holloway by Lionel Pike. The unaccompanied Stanford anthem, Beate Quorum, sung in the 1973 recording from King's College, Cambridge with David Wilcox. But after 1975, it was really Dr. Jackson's playing of Stanford's organ pieces that really did inspire me. I recall some fabulous, energetic performances of the Prelude in the Form of the Toccata, and of course the piece that FJ recorded, which was played by Walter Parrott at the opening of the Minster organ in 1903, the Fantasia and Toccata, Opus 57. Here it is, not in the commercial recording, but from a Minster live recital by FJ given in 2002. Stanford's organ sonatas are a bit like the Widor symphonies in that there isn't really one in which all the movements are of equally good quality all the way through. The best movement, I suppose, is the Benedictus, the middle movement from the Sonata Britannica, which I first heard played by Dr. Jackson in 1981. Then there's the middle movement of the Sonata Eroica, Stanford's Sonata Eroica that is, which was played at Churchill's funeral in 1965. The late Robin Langley, the librarian of the Royal College of Organists, used to say to me that the lower the opus number with Stanford, the better the music actually was. I'm not quite sure about that. I sort of know what he means, but in fact Stanford wrote some wonderful music during the time of the First World War. This included 24 preludes for piano in all keys, not 48 but 24, which covers it of course. Some of these are so organ-like that I decided to take 5 of them and arrange them for the organ. These were published by Oxford University Press last year in a Stanford organ album. Here they are now, played on the organ of the Coffee House, where they were recorded last summer for the York Organists Association by James Radcliffe. So thank you all very much for watching this afternoon. And here to end is a performance of my arrangement of the exquisite Stanford part song, The Blue Bird. In its choral version, this has a soprano solo which simply ends with a sustained top E flat on the word blue. It makes an equally wonderful meditative organ piece.